Welcome to my winter studio. This is the A7C II, the tiny body of the A7C with the sensor of the A7 IV and the AI autofocusing chip of the A7R5 and the ZVE1. Let's do a quick walk through the menu and explain why I prefer particular settings. Let's open the menu and we start with the main menu. That's new for those who come from the A7 IV. But every camera since the ZVE1, the FX30, A7R5 and everything, they all have this main menu. This is the photo mode, so it's only one tap at the moment. In here you find shutter speed, aperture, over and under exposure, ISO and even the RAW files. Now you will see you've got the uncompressed and compressed RAWs, as you all know. But you also have lossless compressed, LMS, large, medium, small. Now this means you will lose megapixels, but you will have smaller files. Sometimes if you're working only for social media, it's easier to work in medium or even small formats. In the old cameras you could do this with the JPEGs, but now you can also do it with the RAWs, which is useful. But I mostly use uncompressed RAWs because you can push the shadows and the highlights any which way you want. You've got the white balance, flash possibilities, and you've got even your JPEG image size. So same as with the RAW image size, the lossless RAW image size, you can choose between large, medium and small. Now we go to the drive modes. You got continuous shooting, you got single shot of course on top. Then you've got continuous shooting, which I use most of the time. And then you got the self timer, the bracketing, and all the bracketing functions. And of course, since the A7R5, every camera has received focus bracketing, or as we also know it, focus stacking. Here you can go in camera, choose how many images you make, how wide steps are in between every shot, and you can even install to get all these shots in one folder, and then you can import that into the software that has been made for focus stacking, and let the software like for example even Photoshop do its work. But there's a different video especially on that, so I won't go any deeper into it. So here we enter the white balance settings. Of course Sony has pretty decent auto white balance, but you can also choose basic settings like underwater, daylight, flash, or you can choose color temperature settings, so choose your kelvins according to the image you're making, and even completely personalize the color temperature visually. So now we enter the focus area options. When you choose white, the camera will search in the end on the complete sensor where it can focus, where it finds something to focus. If you go, however, into zone, it will only search into that zone. Now the old DSLR users will most likely use center focus. Something more useful we use these days is of course the tracking, or the expanded spot tracking, where you choose an image, you choose something, and then you can reframe or have the camera follow this object or this subject throughout the frame. This is the focus mode these are the focus mode options. Of course, single shot, pretty standard. Continuous autofocus is with the real-time autofocus, pretty useful. I'm using it most of the time whenever things are moving or I'm moving, so it will continuously refocus and recalibrate. DMF means it's gonna autofocus and you can adjust it, and then of course manual focus. So now let's switch into video mode, and you will see you have two main menu tabs. First tab, you got all the basics, so frames per second, aperture, and number 2 has a pretty new one. So log on off means very simply, are we shooting in S-Log or not? So S-Log will not be in the list with picture profiles, you have to activate it here in this tab. Of course, we have only off on or on this camera. This is not an FX camera. We have all the cinema options. And if you want, you can embed your own LUT files. So yes, you can rename even your video files. We'll see that later on. So as I said, in the picture profiles, number 11 is the famous S-Cinetone, and you can then upload also personal LUTs. We have breathing compensation in this camera. Remember, it will crop into your image. And we're back to photo. Let's go through the rest of the menu. So I like shooting a RAW plus JPEG, redundancy, and of course in video we've got the XAVC options. HS means H265 and S means H264. 264 gives larger files but is easier on your computer when you're editing afterwards. Remember, if you put it in frame rate 50p, it will automatically go into Super 35 instead of full frame. Yes, 422 10-bit video is absolutely a lot better for editing and color grading than the 8-bit 420s. Both in video and in stills, you can choose to shoot in full frame or in APS-C. There's a complete video about all the possibilities and all the things you have to know about shooting APS-C on a full frame camera. So I won't go into deep with that. Just if you're not sure, leave it in auto and then it will adapt on itself when you're using an APS-C lens on your full frame camera. In your file and folder settings, you can set the name of the files. I always use the name of the camera as the starting name of the file, and I use the folder name in date form, which means every day there will be made a new folder with that date. So if you're making a trip of several days, or you're doing shoots for several days, or an event of several days, each day will automatically have its own folder. You can also use copyrights, set them into the EXIF files of your camera. This is where you do it. And if you don't want to put in the serial number because you stole the camera, well, here you can deactivate that. But please don't steal my camera. We're back to the focus bracketing and drive modes. And very importantly, interval shooting or time-lapse options. If you use this sometimes, please put it in your favorites menu. Makes life so much easier. If you're using the electronic shutter, of course, you automatically go into electronic shutter mode instead of mechanical shutter mode. In mechanical shutter mode, you can activate the option that your shutter closes the moment you deactivate your camera. Of course, with the electronic shutter, that's not going to happen. But here you can activate and deactivate all the options you need. With the anti-flicker settings, the camera will do its utmost best to reduce flicker as much as possible. And now we go to steady shot. If you set this to manual, then of course you have to give the camera the information on what focal length you're using. On auto, the camera will decide for itself. Zoom is of course only possible in JPEG or in video. Clear image zoom is pretty good to use. And then grid lines to help you determine where something has to be put inside the frame. Live view, of course, if you put a live view off, then you won't be able to see everything you've changed. With the bulb setting, the shutter stays open for the time you've indicated in here. So this is for really long exposures. In this case, well, 260 seconds. Putting in the minimums and maximums for the auto ISO, and of course the minimum and maximum for the normal ISO. Now this is an interesting one and I always have trouble explaining it. Minimum shutter speed for auto ISO. So what happens when you're in auto ISO, you put in a minimum and a maximum ISO the camera is able to use. Now those are hard limits. If you're using auto ISO in aperture priority mode, what's going to happen is you're going to set an aperture, you're going to set a maximum ISO limit, and then you're going to say with this function what is the minimum speed the camera is allowed to use. So for example, if you're setting 1/25th of a second, the camera will do everything in its power to go either higher when possible, when there's enough light, or to the limit of 125. Now, do remember, if there is so little light that 1/25th is impossible to keep up, then the camera will go below this limit. But it will do everything it's possible to use 1/25th of a second or faster. I might do a special video on it one time, but I'll try to explain it properly. Alas, there is no special dial for exposure compensation on the A7C series like there is on the bigger alpha bodies. Luckily on this camera you can change it through on the touchscreen and through the main menu. Metering mode, that's where you want to measure your light. And something important, when you spot metering, this one will tell you if you're always metering in the center or if you're metering where the focus point link is, which means the point where you're focusing, where your focus point is lying, it will measure the light on that point. And that's a useful one. With the shutter auto white balance lock, it's you who decides when the camera has to lock the white balance when you're using auto white balance. Either when you half press the shutter or on the first image when you're using continuous shooting. Pretty handy because sometimes when you're doing a longer burst, the light may change and the image might get a little bluer or yellower. Now the creative looks are important for those who like to use JPEGs or who use RAW plus JPEG and use the JPEGs to send them immediately to their clients. You can completely personalize those settings. Zebras indicate where there's too much light and you can decide whether to adjust for it or not. We all know the focus modes. Now we have full-time DMF, which means you can continue to adjust manually the autofocus. Full-time DMF is of course only possible with certain lenses, but then beware when you touch your focusing ring. Red is my color. Now, if you let the focus point circulate, it means if it goes out the frame on the right, it will re-enter the frame on the left or top or bottom. Some people find it useful, others don't. But in this case, you can also adjust the speed at which the frame moves. Now we go to the subject recognition. And since this is the same AI focusing chip as the A7R5, the CVE1, you get, of course, all the possibilities between human, animal plus birds, animals, birds, insects, cars, trains, planes. When you're using birds and animals together, you can prioritize the kind of animal you prefer having in focus first. When they're both in the frame, you can tell the camera what it has to recognize first. It has to look for an eye or a head or a body. When you're photographing cheetahs or Dalmatians or birds do not look like normal birds, it might be interesting to not try and have the camera look for an eye, but for a body. Now in the detailed settings you can decide all the sensitivities, how sticky the tracking should be. Those are advanced settings. If you're new to the camera, leave them as they are and change them whenever you feel confident about it. So as you can see, if you put it at 1, it will switch from subject to subject very quickly, and if you put it on 5, it will try and keep onto your subject as long as possible. It will be very sticky. And here you can decide which kind of subjects your camera is allowed to recognize. So if you only shoot birds, you might deselect all the others. Select right eye, left eye. For portraits, that's pretty useful. And if you don't want the frame to be displayed around the subject it has recognized, then you can put it off here. Now, of course, it cannot recognize a human face. That has been programmed when you're in animal mode. So here you can prioritize registered faces. So here you can register faces, which is useful when you're doing, for example, a wedding and you want the bride and groom's faces to be prioritized. Playback mode is, well, as you know it. And with photo capture there's a different video on it, so I'd say look at it, it's pretty useful when you're shooting video and you want some stills out of it. Now, playback is almost the same as with the A7 IV, so if you're coming from that camera it will be pretty logical. If you're coming from, for example, an A7 III, you will see some new things like a display as a group. So if you had made a burst, you shot images in a burst, then they will be displayed as a group. You can show or not show the focus frame, which means where the camera has focused. You can jump through images, not one by one, but 10 by 10 or 100 even, depending on the dial you're using. Do remember that when you're trying to connect this camera to your smartphone or your tablet, that it does not use the Imaging Edge app, but Creators app. Okay, USB streaming, you can record it or not. And you can stream up to 25p in 4K for those who want to. Now let's program some custom keys. These are the ones I've put onto the camera, but of course, as I said at the beginning, there are way less buttons than on a larger alpha body, so for me it's getting used to. In video, you can either follow the same functions as using for stills, or you can program different ones. For example, I've added zoom, the clear image zoom into this one. And then you've got the functions for display and for, well, for example, cutting photos out of videos. We can go to the FN, the function menu settings, which can be different for photo and video as well. With this function, different sets for stills and movies, you decide which settings are not brought over in between those two. So for example, it's pretty useless to use a picture profile, video picture profile in stills. So I've set this to not go into stills. Same with shutter speed. These are the settings you can see in your viewfinder or on your LCD screen. These are my preferred touch settings. Most of the time when people complain about touch functions not working, it's because they've changed something in here and they don't remember what. If you set menu off for touch, then of course don't complain that you can't touch your menu. Now for people who have difficulties seeing or difficulties hearing, these are a few options to improve accessibility. A high quality of display will of course drain your battery faster. Question about the heat. Auto power off temperature. If you don't put this too high, then your camera might shut down when it becomes a little warm. Always keep in mind, setting this too high is at your own risk. I've set it too high on, well, all my cameras, and for some reason I haven't had any problems with them really overheating and causing having damage in all those years I've used them. But it's at your own risk. Most HDMI settings are pretty standard. This is an interesting one. Recording media during HDMI output, which means the camera will continue recording onto the card inside the camera, even when it's streaming its image through an HDMI cable to a television or a monitor or something. And you can put in timecode if you want to. Shutter when power off simply means the shutter will close when you power off the camera. Do remember this does not work with the electronic shutter if you haven't adapted it silent mode menu. And please do not touch the shutter leaves. Please do not. Yes, this was version 1.0 because this video was recorded in December 2023 and I didn't feel up to doing the voiceover or editing it, sorry. So now we have the My Menu settings, or the favorites menu. In here you can add all the items, you can sort them in a way that's logical for you. I do it all the time with cameras that I use for longer periods, which means that I don't have to go back into the menu for all the items all the functions that I use are in the favorite menu. And at the end, of course, once everything has been done, please put in an old card, an old SD card for example, and save your settings onto that card. That way, if something happens to your camera, or you get another camera, a second one, you can simply reload those settings onto the camera. And please do give it a name that allows you to remember what camera these settings are for. And there we are.
The A7C gives you a good idea of what the A7 IV might be like. Well, specs wise, because body wise, of course, this is a C camera, a compact camera, which means it has only one card slot, so no redundant recording. It has the viewfinder of the Cs. It doesn't have all the buttons that I need to program and use. So it's great for on a holiday when you're traveling. It's great for social documentary photographers and street photographers who need to be, well, almost unseen and discreet. But for someone who does events and portraits, well, I'm not going to use it for those. I'm going to use it to travel with, probably. And then it will be great because it has, of course, all the features of an A7 IV and the autofocusing of the A7R5. But, well, for professional customers, I prefer 2 card slots so I can be redundant. I prefer having a great viewfinder, and I prefer having all the buttons to program and use. So, see you next time with the A6700.